And our first talk this morning is going to be an excellent way to start the day and set the scene by exploring what people really think about science and religion in the UK today. Very pleased to be able to introduce Dr. Nick Spencer, who is Senior Fellow at Theos. Nick is also Visiting Research Fellow at the Faiths and Civil Society Unit at Goldsmiths, University of London, and a Fellow of the International Society of Science and Religion. Now, for the past 3 years, Nick's been working on a Theos and Faraday Institute partnership research project exploring attitudes to science and religion in the UK, culminating in the report Science and Religion Moving Away from the Shallow End, which was published last year. And Nick's latest book, which is called Magisteria: The Entangled Histories of Science and Religion, is about to be published, I think, next March. So get your pre-orders in now. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Nick for our first talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Now, I can see slides, but you can't yet. Am I not in full slide mode? I'm not even sure what it is, got to be honest with you. Ah, I see. Wonderful, thank you. And I can go like that. Excellent, good. Well, good morning to you in this room. Good morning to you elsewhere around the world. It's lovely to be here. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for the introduction. My name's Nick Spencer. I'm Senior Fellow at Theos. I'm going to say a little bit about Theos by way of introduction to my general theme about moving away from the shallow end, but I'm also going to just ruin the plot for you by telling you who done the murder, really, what I'm actually going to say. I'm not here to tell you this morning that science and religion are compatible, which might seem like a strange way to begin. I'm not, of course, going to tell you that they're incompatible. What I want to do with the talk, which is based on the research project we've been doing for 3 years or so, is to suggest that there are actually lots more interesting questions underlying that simple compatibility and incompatibility. Indeed, even posing the issue in that way, are science and religion compatible or incompatible, presupposes that science and religion are the kind of clear, homogeneous, coherent, identifiable entities that can be meaningfully compared to one another. And whereas there is a very rich dialogue and conversation to be had between them, the way that the entire discussion is set up sometimes can be really problematic. And I hope I can explain what I mean by that as I go along. But to say a little bit about Theos, Theos is a Christian think tank. We were launched in November 2006 with the support of the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Cardinal Archbishop of Westminster, but I'm always at pains to emphasize it was with the warm spiritual support of both of them rather than the hard financial support of either of them. We remain independent of any particular Christian denomination. Our objective really is to tell a better story about Christianity, specifically faith generally in contemporary public life, better in the sense of more accurate. Research lies right at the heart of what we do, but also better, I hope, in the sense of more winsome, more appealing, more attractive, more cogent, more coherent. And we do this through a number of means. We conduct research, we publish books, we publish reports, we engage in media interventions, we have events, we run podcasts, and our big annual event is our annual lecture. And that's now been going since 2008. And the first person to deliver our annual lecture was Mark Thompson, who was at the time Director General of the BBC. And it was quite a coup for us, really. He obviously wanted to have a platform to make a speech about the relationship between religion and the media. And we managed to persuade him that we were the right platform for that. And he gave a very thoughtful lecture to an invited audience in central London. And then in the Q&A afterwards, somebody put their hand up and asked the question, and they said, Ben Elton, the comedian, had recently given an interview in which he said that when he was writing jokes for the BBC, he was asked to treat Christians and Muslims differently. The questioner said, is that the case? Now, Mark Thompson could have said, no, that's absolutely not true at all. BBC treats all religions exactly the same. No one would have believed him, but it would have been an easy way just to move on from the question. But to his credit, Mark Thompson tried to give an explanation. He said, yes, that was the case. And the reason that was the case in the UK was because they're different socioeconomic groups too, different cultural groups. They're often different ethnic groups. They're not simply comparable religious groups. And that was why we had different approaches to the way we talked about them, say, through comedies. Now, you can think that's a good thing, you can think that's a bad thing, but it was a thoughtful and honest answer. In the audience that night, there were quite a few journalists, including some journalists from the Daily Telegraph and the Daily Mail. And not entirely surprisingly, perhaps, in the write-up of the lectures the next day in the Mail and the Telegraph, they ignored everything he'd actually said in the lecture and focused on that particular answer in the questions. Not in the audience that night was a journalist from the Daily Star. But that didn't stop the Daily Star picking up on the Telegraph and the Mail's story the next day, and the following day running not just with a headline, but with a front page, which said, just in case you can't see it, BBC put Muslims before you. And in case you had any real difficulty in discerning the subtle sort of message, there's a close-up of that. Now, for a small Christian organization that had been going for precisely 2 years at the time, this was a heart-stopping moment for us. Of course, that wasn't what we were saying. That emphatically wasn't what we were providing a platform for anybody to say. It wasn't really what Mark Thompson was saying at all, but there was a deep pre-existing narrative in place. And if certain people in the audience heard things that deepened that narrative further, that was what the headline was going to be. Such a media stir did it cause that we even got in the Guardian on the same day through their Media Monkey diarist, who said, who'd have thought it? Theology on the front page of the Daily Star. Admittedly, it does have a TV angle, as it's a story claiming the BBC Director General, Mark Thompson, made a speech saying that the corporation does not treat all religions the same. But Media Monkey bets that when the learned public theology think tank Theos invited Thompson to speak, it hadn't planned on landing the Star Splash. You bet your bottom dollar we hadn't planned it on landing the Star Splash. But it was an interesting example to us about how the headline isn't always reflective of the reality, and how there are deep narratives cut into the kind of the fabric of our common life, which just get deepened repeatedly. And time again, that happened for us. We did a piece of work looking at mental health issues in the UK and the potential for Christian theological and pastoral responses to it. Interviewed a number of people. A few of them, small number of them, made a comment about how they were worried about the rise in exorcisms, particularly from Pentecostal migrant churches in London, and how this was a concern, particularly when people were suffering from genuine mental health problems. Of course, that was the angle that picked up. Astonishing rise in demand for exorcisms put mental health at risk, report finds. Not really what the report found, but there we go. Spiritual abuse, the Guardian ran with. Christian think tank warns of sharp rise in UK exorcisms. You could just about read that, but it of course wasn't what we were saying. It's not just us, of course, who've been a victim of this. When Rowan Williams tried to reflect intelligently on the way in which the Boxing Day tsunami in 2004 was a challenge to any serious, thoughtful faith. The Sunday Telegraph ran with the title, "The Archbishop of Canterbury admits this doubt makes me doubt the existence of God." Now, what, you may ask, has any of this got to do with religion? You probably can guess. There are deep, deep narratives around science and religion that are cut into our public life trenches, if you like. And they're largely because of this man. He's John William Draper. Born in this country, immigrated to the US in about 1840 or so, an eminent chemist, became the first president of the American Chemical Association, and an eminent academic as well. He was originally a Methodist. His father was a Methodist minister, but he kind of drifted away from his faith when he was in the US. But he did preserve what was an early 19th century Methodist antipathy towards Catholicism. And he was also in the vanguard of a movement in the back half of the 19th century that saw in science, especially growing professionalization of science, almost some sort of salvific promise. And in 1876, for various reasons, 1874, various reasons, he published a book entitled History of the Conflict Between Religion and Science. And what this effectively did was to read the entire history of science and religion, those homogeneous terms again, through the lens of the particular concerns in the 1860s and 70s and 80s. Now, at that time, I won't go into too much historical detail here, but at that time, we're seeing a reassertion of Catholic dogma, and also in America, a large influx of Catholic migrants, and that made Protestant America, and particularly kind of intellectually free Protestant America, very concerned. And there were other reasons behind Draper's book, but what he then did was read the entirety of primarily Christian, in fact, primarily Catholic history through the lens of a conflict through war. He picked up things like the Galileo affair, which had actually been a Protestant propaganda tool in the 17th century against Catholicism, and then deployed it entirely against Christianity. And there was enough truth in the narrative for it to stick. And then 20 years later, Andrew Dickson White wrote an even longer book on the history of the war between science and theology in Christendom, and that was very popular because he had a very good publicist behind it, and the narrative got absolutely set in stone. And it's really only begun to unravel in the last 40, 50 years or so. The academic discipline of the history of science and religion is relatively new. And it was only in the 1980s and early 1990s when a couple of big academic books were published that more attention got paid to this narrative, and came clearly to be seen that actually, historically, science and religion have been much, much, much more closely aligned and positively aligned than Draper and White and their followers have it. I've got, as you heard, I've got a book coming out in a month or so's time that tries to, as it were, disentangle that particular narrative and argue that the results, the history has been far more positive. But in a sense, that isn't quite what I want to say today, because I want us to go a little bit deeper than that particular point, because, as I said, just arguing that science and religion are compatible as opposed to incompatible. I mean, historically, if you were forced to choose between the two, compatibility is more accurate than incompatibility. But nonetheless, if you would ask anyone in 1500 or 1600 or even 1800 whether science and religion were compatible or incompatible, they wouldn't even have understood what you meant, because science and religion, as we talk about those terms today, meant different things through history. We have inherited that simplistic dichotomy from Draper and White and others, and it is pretty deep within our culture. So as part of the research project we've been doing with Faraday over the last 3 years or so, we asked people a series of questions. This is one of the very simplistic questions we asked them on a scale of 1 to 10, where 1 is completely incompatible and 10 is completely compatible. Please indicate where you think the relationship between the two is. Basically, by a proportion of 2 to 1, people see the two to be incompatible rather than compatible. And not that we have longitudinal data on this, but I'm pretty sure that one of the reasons for this is the legacy of the New Atheist movement. That's very much kind of, that wave is broken now, but our first research project with Faraday was in 2009, which was the big Darwin anniversary, 200 years since his birth, 150 years since the publication of The Origin of Species. And at the time, this is 2 or 3 years after The God Delusion was published and the New Atheist movement is in full swing, Darwin is the poster boy for intelligent atheism. Now, if you've ever read a biography of Darwin, I ended up reading quite a few of them, you'll know that's pretty unfair, because Darwin did lose his faith, partly because of evolution, not entirely, but he denied to his dying day that you couldn't be a theist, couldn't be a believer in God and an evolutionist. But back in 2009, you have two effectively trenches. This was the cartoon that a friend of mine produced for the research project we were doing, when you have the new atheists hurling their texts towards, somebody might be doing this, towards young earth creationists in the background who are hurling texts back at them. And poor old Darwin is stranded in no man's land until he's rescued by a Theos branded helicopter right in the middle. Possibly a slightly arrogant metaphor, but this certainly deepened the trenches, the established narratives that I've been talking about. The interesting thing, and we began to unpick this through our research project, is that when you start playing about with the words and asking people broadly the same, their opinions on the same issue, but with different words, the picture begins to change. So we asked exactly the same question of what do you think about the relationship between science and Christianity, or science and faith, or science and Islam. Again, the preponderance is people seeing them as being incompatible, but fewer people see them as incompatible and fewer people see them as strongly incompatible. So as opposed to 57% seeing incompatibility with science and religion, it's only 50% when it comes to science and Christianity, 47% when it comes to science and faith. Science and Islam is very interesting, primarily because you have a disproportionately large number of people who do not give an opinion on this. They say don't know. And a disproportionate number of people who do give an opinion, give a strong opinion when it comes to Islam, which is why the strongly incompatible actually rises at the end, despite the fact that generally incompatible falls. That's a detail. The point is that if you ask people about a specific religion or faith rather than generic religion, that sense of tension and incompatibility begins to erode slightly. And it erodes still more if you ask them about a specific science and religion. So we ask people a series of questions about the more you know about, insert your scientific discipline, the harder it is to be religious. And you would have thought, given the fact that people on balance see incompatibility between science and religion, for most of these disciplines, you would have thought, therefore, that discipline would make it harder to be religious, because if religion and science are ultimately incompatible, they're incompatible for a reason. And yet, for pretty much all the scientific disciplines we tested, whether it's neuroscience or medical science or psychology or chemistry or climate science or geology, the balance of opinion was against that discipline making it harder to be religious. So in other words, again, just as if you move away from the generic term religion to specific religions, it breaks down. If you move away from the generic term science to specific sciences, it begins to break down. The only disciplines, such as they are disciplines, in which there was a more equal balance was the Big Bang and astronomy and cosmology, which does tend to suggest that because people see a greater level of tension there, it's because they interpret religion as being a cosmological theory. In other words, what's going on here is a classic Pavlovian effect. You'll know Pavlov's dogs, who were always alerted to being fed by a little bell being rung until cruel Pavlov stopped feeding them but still rang the bell. And they still came running and they still salivated despite the fact there was no food for them to eat. A Pavlovian effect or Pavlovian reaction being one that the actual cause for the reaction isn't there, but we still react in a certain way. Science and religion, that phrase, has a Pavlovian effect on us. We seem to think we understand what those particular terms mean, and we interpret them through that historical lens and that deep narrative that's cut into our public culture about them being in tension. But, and this was the basis of the entire research project, as I mentioned earlier, those terms themselves are relatively recent. Peter Harrison's book, brilliant book, This Territories of Science and Religion, begins, if a historian were to contend that he or she had discovered evidence for a hitherto unknown war that had broken out in the year 1600 between Israel and Egypt, this claim will be treated with some skepticism. Why? Because Israel and Egypt did not exist in 1600. The territories over which the sovereign nations of Israel and Egypt would subsequently exert their authority were there. The geology and the geography hadn't changed, but just the way we understood the way those territories related to one another had changed. Hence my point earlier about had you asked someone in 1600 about the war between science and religion, they simply wouldn't have known what you were talking about. Now, Peter's book ends at the end of the 19th century when, in academic circles at least, we have a reasonably clear and settled idea of what science is and what religion is. But these are big, capacious, socially mediated, and ultimately quite fuzzy terms. And if you begin to ask people, what actually do you mean by science? And what actually do you mean by religion? Very quickly, they start to flounder. And that's what we did. Alongside our quantitative element, that was interviewing 5,000 UK adults, we interviewed 100 or so, 101 in the end, of the great and the good. Everyone from Brian Cox to Susan Greenfield to AC Grayling, to Martin Rees, Philip Ball, Ray Tallis, Adam Rutherford, very high profile, very senior academics, most of whom were scientists, quite a few philosophers in there, some a few theologians, one or two religious studies experts, the majority of them not believers, they're atheists, non-religious, because we wanted effectively to find out what the problem was, so to speak, as it were. And we had to give them a demographic questionnaire, first of all, just to make sure we covered, age, gender, professional qualification, so on and so forth, which included the question about the 10-point scale, compatible, incompatible, simply because, again, we needed to get an idea of what the balance of our sample was. So when they then came into the interviews, which were done on Zoom, because it was all done during COVID, they'd had a question about, on a scale of 1 to 10, how do you think? So they thought this was going to be a proper Noddy and Toyland type interview. And so when we hit them with the question, okay, what does science mean? What is science? You saw that kind of whiplash moment in the interview where people thought, wow, okay, well, I haven't really thought about this. And gratifyingly, a lot of them at the end saying, this has really made me think a lot more deeply about this subject. But time and time again, the answer we got from them was, I don't like that word. The more I think about it, even just saying science is problematic. There are various sciences, but I don't think there is such a thing as science. Science is not reducible to a single idea. There are lots of different sciences. I don't think science is a natural kind or has a core essence rather beautifully. I don't think there's a scientific definition of what science is. These are people who had spent the last 30, 40 years being scientists. And if science was tough, don't even start on religion. It seems to me there are many religions, and to try and reduce them to some common characteristic is a fool's game. I hate these working definitions. It's so context specific. It's something that humans think up rather than something that extrinsically exists in the world. Even people who are religious are often themselves not terribly clear about what they're doing. Well, that's certainly true. But we didn't take no for an answer. And much of the interviews were spent, as we joked with them, just trying to define what these two words mean. The project was effectively a very, very long and ridiculously expensive way of trying to define what two words mean. Because what words mean is fundamentally predicated on how they're used. This is quite a detailed kind of philosophical point that I'm not going to go into here, but it will be unpacked in the monograph that we're eventually going to write from this. When you're looking at socially mediated terms, it's very important to look at that mediation, to look at how terms are used. It doesn't mean they can't be used illegitimately, but it does mean that if you want an accurate idea of what a word means, you've got to look at how it is used. So how is it used? Well, I'm not going to go into too much detail here because I will bore you, but it was used in many, many different ways, and people had lots of different understandings from it. And the more we looked at it and analysed it, we kind of picked out there were 6 different, as it were, dimensions to what science was. There was a methodological dimension. There was a dimension of its subject, what it studied. Science was defined by certain presuppositions that it had. It was defined by certain objectives. It was defined by certain values and critically also by institutional structures. So for example, the scientific method depends on hypothesizing, testability, having certain established practices that ideally could be replicable. It valued accuracy and quantification. You may already be thinking, well, hang on, I can think of some sciences that, that aren't necessarily replicable. And this was precisely the point, that you couldn't necessarily put all sciences, to be a science, you didn't have to tick all of these boxes. The logic here is fuzzy, and some are in and some are out. And there is this classic kind of implicit spectrum people have between physics at one end, that's what real science is, sociology at the other end, or anthropology. And we've got a list of all the different sciences. What is economic science? People had fun with that. The predictions from economic science, the sports science. One person even talked about hermeneutics, literary criticism as a science. One of them talked about theology being a science, which of course, had we done the interviews in 1400, they'd all have been saying that. Science is defined by its subjects. So most of the people we spoke to didn't think that studying texts was a science, despite my little point about hermeneutics then. But if you ask them, what is the subject science? Well, it's nature, except for the fact that the social sciences are legitimate sciences. In any case, nature is hardly an easy to define term. And what about economic science? Well, is it therefore observable? Yes, technically, but not unaided, certainly. Well, is it study of the material world? Yes, but science has a subject to it. By definition, it is something that's subject. It is a subject, but precisely how you define that subject gets challenging. It absolutely needs presuppositions. As our non-believing respondent said to us, you can't do science unless you believe that the world is, the creation is lawful, that it's intelligible, that our brains are capable of grasping that intelligence, and that it even exists. Some of our respondents said, the point about science is disinterested. Another said, don't be ridiculous, it's not disinterested at all. It's a cumulative process. It is directional. It wants to be predictive. It actually often wants to be useful. And then it is dependent on certain values that are not scientific at all. You can't have science without collaboration, without intellectual humility, without curiosity, without self-discipline, honesty, instinct, intuition, creativity, and so on and so forth. It's absolutely central to the actual practice of science. And then, critically, there is some public, ideally institutional recognition of people who are doing science. As people said, the guy who was tinkering with stuff in the shed at the bottom of his garden might be brilliant, but he ain't a scientist. And so publishing, having qualifications, being recognized, being employed, they were all parts of what science really was. And religion, I'm conscious of the time, I'm not going to spend too much time on this, had similar, we detected 5 different sort of dimensions to what religion is. There is a commitment to the existence of the transcendent, and for many people that had to be a personal transcendent and an actively involved transcendent, but you understand the words here get very slippery. But there was also something about the fact of personal belief in that. It wasn't just a kind of an intellectual assent to, but it was a personal assent to, and one that should, properly speaking, provoke a response. A bodily, an ethical, a behavioral response, rather than just an abstract belief system. But critically, at least for most of the people we spoke to, religion was formalized as well. It formalized that belief and it formalized that commitment. So you recognize religion by its collective rituals and its ceremonies and its laws and its hierarchies. And again, you get into this kind of debate about, well, does this qualify as religion or does that qualify as religion? And some things that, are full of hierarchy and procession and law and costumes, like the law, for example. Well, that doesn't qualify as a religion. Certain spiritual beliefs that are highly personalized, do they? So it gets complicated. And just in case you were worried that it wasn't complicated enough, there was one other critically important factor, which is best summarized by a quotation from Jerry Coyne, famous American biologist, atheist, sort of quite antagonistic. At one point wrote, "Science operates by using evidence and reason. Doubt is prized, authority is rejected. No finding is deemed true a notion that's always provisional unless it's repeated and verified by others. We scientists are always asking ourselves, how can I find out whether I'm wrong? Now, I've got to be honest with you, I've not actually read very much Jerry Coyne. I picked that up from a book by one of my intellectual heroes, Frans de Waal, Dutch primatologist, who then went on to say, oh, how I wish I had colleagues like Coyne. Having spent all my life among academics, I can tell you that hearing how wrong they are is about as high on their priority list as finding a cockroach in their coffee. This is an incredibly important point in this debate that's so often overlooked. What this debate often does is compare a theoretical understanding of what science is with a descriptive or a practical understanding of what religion is. So you compare science as it appears in the most polished, nipped and tucked textbook to what goes in on your local church week by week, which is messy and human and fallible and problematic. And rather nicely, one of our respondents described it this way: religion sees itself as being the quest for truth, where science, in its strictest sense, in its Sunday best, as it were, is a quest for provisional understanding, which may be revised later. Well, you can quibble about the provisional understanding point, you can quibble about the truth point, but the critical point there is that lovely metaphor, Sunday best. So often, science and religion debate is about comparing science dressed up in its Sunday best with religion dressed up in its really grubby overalls. And yet, that is an unfair comparison. As unfair a comparison as it would be to compare, St. Francis of Assisi or the Sermon on the Mount with examples of scientific fraud. No one would imagine that to be a fair comparison, but in a sense, that's often what happens the other way around. So effectively, what that all does is leave you with just a huge mess. So what we've done here is say, look, everyone, a lot of people you engage with are going to have an opinion of science and religion. And more likely than not, it's going to be an opinion that they're hostile to one another, they're contradictory, their intention. But rather than simply go to them and say, well, hang on, no, they're perfectly intentioned, they're perfectly compatible, it might be worth stepping back and saying, well, hang on, what do you actually mean by science? And what do you mean by religion? Because absolutely, I can find you examples where science and religion are in complete tension with one another. But they're probably not the kind of ideas of science and religion that most of us are wedded to. Sometimes they might be, and then there's a problem if there is. In other words, the way you define the terms in the first instance pretty much dictates the kind of result you're going to get at the end of the discussion. And what we do in the report, some copies are available there, the whole thing is downloadable online, is try and we explain the situation, public opinion in the first part. Then we looked at the shallow end, really, why people think there are these tensions. And then we try and move people towards the deep end. It's predicated, I know you might know the metaphor about religions are a lot like swimming pools. All the noise is at the shallow end. And it's pretty much the same with the science and religion debates. Well, there is an awful lot of noise around the science and religion debate, and much of it is around the shallow end. But there are some very interesting conversations to be had here. And frankly, I think there are conversations that people want to have. Again, what was really fascinating, I cut this slide out, but it's worth mentioning. In our 100 or so academic interviewees, as I said, we're interviewing the Brian Coxes and the AC Graylings, and they are not noted religious sympathizers. And they're disproportionately no religion from their demographic questionnaire, and they're disproportionately atheists, much more so than the public as a whole. And yet, and here was the killer fact for me, whereas for the general public, the view was 2 to 1 in favor of incompatibility when we looked at the generic way, at kind of the top level way, for this group, it was exactly reversed. So roughly speaking, 2/3 of them thought that science and religion were compatible, compared to 1/3 that they were incompatible. This is from people who are not religious believers. Now, I don't want to make too much of that, because a lot of them would have thought they were compatible because they would have redefined religion away from any content to a merely functional social phenomenon. religion and science are compatible because science tells us about the world and religion maybe gives us a bit of ethics possibly, or community and ritual and helping people. That may not be a renegotiation of the term religion that many religious people are happy with. But nonetheless, the fact that these people were prepared to countenance that level of dialogue and arguably even compatibility does tend to suggest to me that people are keen to move away from the kind of he said, she said type of element of this debate. We put together 6 different areas where there can be interesting discussions. Before you bulk at this slide, I'm not suggesting you go back to your flocks and engage in a conversation about epistemology, metaphysics, and hermeneutics. That might not be the most pastorally sensitive thing to do. But nonetheless, each of those long academic sounding words does point towards a discussion that can be had. Epistemology around the question of how do we know what we think we know? Metaphysics, what is the fundamental nature of reality? Hermeneutics, how do we read texts, and particularly how do we read authoritative texts? As an aside, this is a complete aside, I've never talked about this before, it fascinates me that in America there is a very live debate around the interpretation of the Constitution between originalists, and I can't remember the other group, but they're effectively people who argue that when the court's interpreting the Constitution, what they should do is look at the original intent of the founding fathers, compared to others who say, no, if you're interpreting a constitution, you've got to look at how it should be applied today. Remarkably similar to hermeneutic debates in the academy around how you interpret text. In other words, this isn't just a religious thing. It's always the case when you're interpreting any text that's authoritative. To my mind, the most interesting, what does it mean to be human? A topic that might come back to right at the very end of the Q&A, because I think this is going to be the big topic in the 21st century. And ethics and politics. I haven't talked much about these, but they are worth considering. There's a very good academic in the US called John Evans, who wrote a book called Morals, Not Knowledge, which looks at the science and religion debate in the US. And the point he's making there is that most people do not engage with this debate through the lens of epistemology or metaphysics. Most people engage with this debate through what they hear on the news. And what they hear on the news is a scientific development has enabled the cure of, or religious people have campaigned for the banning of. In other words, the lens by means of which they access this entire debate is ethical and political. And so what is good and who gets to decide is probably the most influential part of this whole debate. I'm not, you'll be pleased to hear, going to go through all 6 of these. We will be here for a very long time, but let me give you a flavour of what that debate looks like with just regards to the first one, epistemology, because I think I've got just about enough time to do that. The life at the shallow end, in this part of the epistemological science religion debate, is quite simple. For example, some of our interviewees, science values knowledge of evidence, and I would say that religion values thought despite or because of the lack of evidence. I'm sure we've all heard this many times beforehand. Science values evidence, religion values lack of evidence. Or alternatively, in religions, you have a trump card. You can whip it out and says, God says, or God told me. If you're a Sufi Muslim, I smoked hashish last night and God spoke to me. You can always have a trump card. Yes, arguably there are believers like that. I don't want to deny that. I have no intention of kind of polishing the halo here. But if you think that is typical of religion, you probably haven't spent enough time with religious people, let alone reading proper religious books. Religion can be thoroughly empirical. As one of our interviewees, who was a professor of religion, said, people are very empirical in the way they approach spirituality and religion. They do test it out to see if it's true. It might be that you just have 1 or 2 experiences in your life that are so significant to you that you found that's enough of a basis for your religion. That's not blind faith, just that they're very powerful experiences. Some people won't have powerful experiences, but will feel more human, more fulfilled, more complete through the process of prayer and practice and Eucharist and church or whatever it is. The point is, we don't naturally apply the word empirical to that, but that's kind of what's going on a lot of the time. Religion can, I needn't tell people here today, value intellectual inquiry. You express, this is one of our religious believers, You express your own sense of the divinity by putting your rational mind to the service and understanding of the world that he has created. That is the most fundamental way in which you acknowledge the greatness of God, the mind that he created in the service of understanding the world that he also created. Again, don't deny the fact that there are some religious believers who are very happy to flick the off switch on their brain. But again, it's that classic, I don't know if any of you remember reading Terry Eagleton's famous review of the God Delusion back in the London Review of Books 2006, lunging, flailing, mispunching. It's worth reading just for the entertainment, really. It's one of the most savage reviews you'll ever come across. But he says at one point that the Dawkins approach is that of the, what's the phrase he used, the bumptious junior barrister, whereby you pick up on your opponent's weakest arguments every single time, and you can absolutely steamroll them. Everyone can do that, but that's not an intellectually honest approach to this kind of thing. Religion can be rational and it can be rigorous. The religion based on belief bit is problematic. Non-believer, I think, this one. As well, because at least from what little I know of the history of Christianity, it has been based on evidence. It has been about evidence, and many of our modern institutions of law and science arose out of religious inquiry and exegesis and interpretation of scripture that was evidence-based. Investigation of miracles as well is supposed to be evidence-based. So it's not as clear cut, is it? Now, again, this wasn't this isn't a card carrying. He's not trying to make an apologetic point here, but simply an intellectually honest point that, again, to pretend that the history of religious belief and commitment is simply based on belief in the non-thinking sense, in the non-rational sense, is simply not right. Religion can be developmental or anti-authority. This is one of the biggest kind of attacks that was laid on it. Science, apropos Jerry Coyne, should be always doubting authority. If you're a religious person, you don't doubt authority, you just doff your cap to authority. Okay? Lots of times that is undoubtedly true. Sometimes it's true with a good reason, but to imagine that all religion is authoritarian in that sense and denies intellectual inquiry does a disservice. And in the same way as you can qualify our understanding of religion in this whole epistemological area, you can qualify our understanding of science as well. Science can be underdetermined by the available evidence. In other words, you have certain theories and ideas that seem to be cogent and coherent, but there isn't sufficient evidence for you to consider them to be verifiable. I put verifiable in heavily inverted commas because there's a debate whether any of this is verifiable. We had a surprising number of anthropologists, 3 or 4 anthropologists. So we talked a lot about Neanderthals, which is rather nice and quite entertaining, but a number of them made the point, and some evolutionary biologists made the point, that I think it depends on theories of the origin of early hominids. People keep changing their minds because we don't have very much evidence. The evidence isn't strong enough between theories. Now, physicists at one end might say, well, that's really shows you're not really a science. But the anthropologists, I don't know if there are any physicists or anthropologists in the room, the anthropologists deny that. It's an example of the spectrum of what science is. And you might even possibly dare to use the word faith when it comes to the formulation of certain theories for which that are underdetermined by the evidence. Wouldn't advise using that word because it did send off some sort of Pavlovian reaction amongst people, but science can be highly speculative. Within evolution theory, there are all sorts of speculative propositions which make coherent sense but are not based on empirical experimentation. The scientific method can be overhyped. One of the most interesting points, many of our respondents first of all went to, the difference is the scientific method. That is the difference. This one of our most eminent, I can't name any of these sadly, but very, very eminent scientist, went straight for the jugular. I think it's irrelevant, he said. There is nothing from what scientists do, from what a detective or a lawyer does in following up clues, looking for evidence and testing reliability. It's a very fair point. Science, that said, is committed to non-scientific values. Science have moral commitments of truthfulness, honesty. They value hard work. They hate negligence and deceitfulness. Brackets, this is all in theory, of course. Quite a few moral things that are clearly not justifiable in terms of science, but scientists have to proceed with them. Science can be faith or authority-based. Going back to my point earlier, very honest point from this respondent. I said science isn't faith-based, but it is. I haven't read a paper on global warming. I haven't looked at the studies. I believe in global warming because everyone tells me to believe in global warming. But that authority that's authority in my world. I think that's a very important point. I gave a talk on this down in Southampton for Keith and the Christians in Science crew down there last November. And it's rather nice. I'm having this lecture in a lecture hall. Don't tell me there are no authority structures within the actual practice of science. Otherwise, you wouldn't have lecture halls. You think about the symbolic nature of what's going on there. Me telling you certain things. You might go and verify it afterwards, but there's certainly authority structures going on. So moving to the deep end, and I'll come into land here, and then one more thing I want to show you. There are different ways of arriving at knowledge about the world. We arrive at knowledge about the world, about ourselves, about other people in different ways. Some of you might be familiar with the work of Ian McGilchrist, who's a brilliant psychiatrist rather, and neuroscientist and philosopher. And he writes about the difference in the left brain and the right brain, and how each has different approaches. I'm going to simplify that too much. Ian McGilchrist's work is very good here. The point is that there are more ways of knowing about the world than simply that which is kind of hyped in the scientific method. So how do you bring that to a wider congregation? I think there are lots of interesting ideas there. These are two ideas that I want to leave you with. scienceandreligioncompass.org is a website we've set up on the back of the project. It asks people a whole chance of questions about their attitudes to science and religion. It gives them a temperature for where they are on the compatibility scale, but it also then places them on a quadrant and tries to get them to understand why they think the way they do about science and religion. So again, it's trying to expand people's understanding of what's going on here. The spectrum is functional to substantial when it comes to religious, and scientific to pluralist when it comes to science. It's explained in the quadrant, but the point is, yes, people take their temperature, but then you try and understand, what do I actually think science is, and what do I think religion is? And then one more fun thing, which was the result of this project, which I'll let you set up now whilst I just talk about it, was a short animation, although it took about 9 months to do because she's so good, by my colleague Emily Down, which puts some of these ideas into a hopefully digestible and entertaining and certainly rather beautiful format. And I want to leave you with that by way of closing. Can we hear it?
Things look very different from far off. Perceptions change. Things look very different from far off. Perceptions change when you see the details. Many people look at science and religion and see conflict. But what if what looks like conflict is actually just conversation? People talking, agreeing, disagreeing, sometimes passionately, about the biggest questions in life. Is the universe simply pure chance, or are its laws fine-tuned for a reason? Is evolution too wasteful to be the design of a loving God? Or is there a direction, perhaps even a purpose to it? When did we become recognizably human? And what makes us different from other animals? Is the brain just a complex machine? And if so, can humans ever truly be free? The questions are as much about religion as they are about science. Are spiritual experiences a sign of something deeper? Or are they simply an illusion of the brain? How should we read holy books? Are creation stories bad science or good poetry? If nature obeys laws, is there a lawgiver? And is it possible to believe in miracles? These conversations are ultimately about who we are and how we live in the world. Are humans material or spiritual, or both? Should we look to science, religion, both or neither for moral guidance? Is altruism just an evolutionary trick, or is it a glimpse of who we were made to be? These are science and religion conversations. Sometimes our opinions feel worlds apart, but at others they seem to align. Will you watch from a distance, or will you join the conversation?
Great. Well, Nick, thank you so much for your talk. I think you've given us all a fascinating insight into the history, to start with, of how we've got to where we are on current perceptions of science and faith in the UK, and also how complex this all is. But also, perhaps, most importantly, how we can go deeper and help those in our churches to go deeper in understanding some of these issues. So thank you so much for your talk. Now, we now got the opportunity. We've got about 15 minutes, so good length of time for some questions and discussion. So the way that we are going to do this, for those who are participating online, if you could raise your hand in the metaphorical sense, i.e., using the button at the bottom of the screen to raise your hand, so that we can just see if you'd like to ask a question, and you'll then be able to ask that question verbally to Nick and the rest of the participants. And for anyone in the room here, if you just raise your physical hand, then we can see that and pick that up. Okay, let's make a start. Let's start with, do we have a question in the room that anyone would like to ask to pick up on what Nick's been talking about? And that's a good point. Yeah, if you're in the room, please make sure that you use the microphone so that everybody online can hear what's being said.
Thank you, Nick. So my question is, what do you think are the limitations in the depths of knowledge in science when we look at a theological understanding?
The limitations, the depth of knowledge of science when going to empirical understanding. Could you unpack the question slightly more, because I want to make sure I try and answer the right one.
Yeah. So a number of people within churches might not necessarily engage with science because there is a knowledge deficit and a lack of understanding, because we're serving in churches with people from different educational backgrounds. Some have gone to school, some haven't gone to school. And when you look at the plethora of science and what science is, and just you unpacking today, what do you think then are the limitations for science to be reachable for the ordinary individual who has got a faith that is seeking understanding?
Yeah. Well, if I understand the question rightly, one of the reasons why I mentioned that John Evans point at the end was that I find this stuff very, very interesting. I suspect most people here would probably be here otherwise, find it very, very interesting. But it's important not to give the impression that to be a rounded believer, you have to have a full grasp of science generally. I think there is a general public interest in science, but I also think that the lens by means of which most people engage with this is an ethical and political one, I mentioned there. And so it's probably more important to be able to engage with them through that lens than it is through any of the other more narrowly scientific ones that I talked about, epistemology and metaphysics. The presupposition that I started with, the tension, it is historical, but it's also reinforced by a lot of the news stories people will be encountering, whereby, as I said, the way that things are framed, the science has achieved this, science has made this progress, whereas religious leaders are questioning the legitimacy of, so it's reactionary or it's certainly against progress. And I think that is probably the most important conception of science and the science and religion tension that needs to be addressed in most people. Great if you can then go on to some of the other issues, but I think the entry point will be understanding science and religion debate through the ethical and political lens. Is that a good answer? I'm not entirely sure I've answered the question. Do you want to come back?
You know, it's all science. It is helpful, but I guess again, it's that depth of knowledge of the sciences and the limitations that we have as people. But as you're saying, I think rightfully, it's the conversations that are going to be important for anyone who is in church leadership or church ministry to engage with conversation, with science, with the people that they shepherd. Because one of the dangers that are there is that if the leader chooses not to engage in science, you won't have sermons around science in the church.
Yeah.
But if the conversations are going to happen around science and about the wide breadth of it, it'll be very helpful, because it's not a blind faith, as you were saying. And by matter of what we believe in, it's almost like faith seeking understanding.
Yeah.
So we're not just going to believe things blindly, but we're going to explore more. But then we need to be able to equip the people that we serve, so that when they go out into the community and speak to the people that they share with, they're speaking from an intelligent perspective, rather than to have a deficit in terms of intellectual engagement with the subject matter.
I think that's right. And I think that the most important thing is to keep the conversation open. Some of you may know Tom Holland. He's a historian, hugely popular, wrote a book called Dominion. He, I think, had a kind of general Christian upbringing, got to the age of 12 or so, absolutely loved dinosaurs, spoke to minister, and I think the conversation, wasn't there. And he said, and not an uncommon phenomenon. And that doesn't mean you then have to have a very good answer to, any Paleolithic questions that congregation might ask. But I do think the willingness to keep conversations open is probably the most important thing. Closing them down is the worst thing that could happen.
Should we see if we've got any questions online? Maybe just if you can.
Thank you, Doctor. That was excellent. Thank you very much. Just with regards to what Charmaine said, I find that what your graph, you came up with a graph, 50% people, Christians, believe in science and they agree with it. 17% in a church are very vehemently against it. It was a 50-17. My experience as a Christian in the last 24 years or so, in the churches that I've been to, there seems to be a lack of practicing what they believe in when it comes to, say, giving preachers. I've never heard any preach in my lifetime as a Christian on science subjects, particularly the origins of man. I've never heard any teachings of children with regards to science. In fact, I've heard teachers say that all the dinosaurs were put onto the ark, and yet there's been no responsibility from Christians in the know to actually challenge this. I've heard evangelists just speak about the gospel, but when it comes to the basics of Genesis, they don't know the answers to that. And I think it's irresponsible to be teaching evangelism without understanding the basics. So when you say that we should be actually pushing this in the churches and that, I feel that there's a severe lack of courage to do that and how to do that. And I would like to know how we should go about doing that.
what you said there remind, but I don't know if anyone here remembers the old BBC comedy Yes Minister and Yes Prime Minister, based in sort of Whitehall in the 1980s. And there's a bit in it where two of the civil servants are talking to one another, and one of them says to the other one, Bernard, do you know what happens if the right people aren't in charge? The wrong people are. And it's a line that always goes through my head with regard to this. Do you know what happens if the right people aren't having these conversations? The wrong people have the conversation. In other words, if you see the ground and you don't engage in open, frank debate about this, you will get people who do engage in debate, but do so in unhelpful ways. I'm nervous about answering the question directly because I'm not a minister, and I don't like saying, well, ministers should do this, because there are lots of demands on a minister's time, and I've spoken to many ministers who frankly say, this isn't my field, I'm not comfortable with it. I mean, kind of this is what Faraday is so very good at. It's about building confidence, it's about keeping conversations open, and it's about equipping not just ministers, but people in the congregations who might be more comfortable to have those conversations, to have them. So the minister has a chance to say, look, this is really my area of expertise, but I know A, B, and C in the congregation who are medics or scientists or whatever would be happy to have that conversation because they're equipped to do so. The other thing I would strongly suggest is that this doesn't become a shibboleth issue, really. And I'm all for a range of interesting and varied and exciting sermons. But I'm always a bit nervous about saying we should preach about science, because I think that's part of the conversation. But I don't think there are many people who go to church on a Sunday who do want that to be the focus of the sermon. They might be interested in that subject, they might want to engage in it. But there is a difference between the kind of implicit authority and directional teaching that comes from preaching from a pulpit and the more discursive conversations that exist in lots and lots of other church buildings. And I kind of think this is a discursive conversation. I want to stay away from the idea that you have to have certain scientific beliefs to be a Christian, or that when you become a Christian, you no longer have any questions about this stuff, because frankly, that ain't my experience. But to do that, to have that openness and the willingness to recognize doubt and uncertainty, whilst at the same time maintaining fellowship, I think that's more fruitfully done in, as it were, parallel conversations.
Yeah, and it's probably worth just adding very briefly that, because it's a great question that you're asking. That is one of the questions which we will be trying to address in some of the later sessions in this course as well. So there's different sort of insights and ways of thinking about that. Sarah, do we have a question from online?
We don't so far. If you're online and you'd like to ask a question and you are having trouble using the electronic means, feel free to just physically put up your hand. If your camera's on, we should be able to see you.
And well, while we're waiting to see if there's any questions online, I have a question for you, Nick. So you talked about how the New Atheism movement in the sort of early 2000s was a really big influence, has had a huge influence on the perception of science and faith today, with lots of other bits of history obviously feeding into that. But looking forward, if this whole project was to be rerun in 5 years' time or 10 years' time, based on the kind of the issues and influences on society that are really driving people's perspectives now, what do you think would be, I mean, you've kind of touched on this a little bit, and actually the video at the end also touched on this a bit, but what do you think are the biggest influences, if you like, that would affect the responses in 5 years' time that are happening in society now, in the church and everywhere?
It's a really good question. So the one thing I would say is that I think the New Atheist movement was influential. I think what it did is just continue to deepen that existing narrative. But I don't think it changed it significantly, not least because a surprising number of our interviewees, fully paid up atheists, etc., said at some point in the interview or towards the end, I'm not Dawkins type. They actively try to distance themselves from that whole rhetoric. And it is interesting, one of the questions we asked in the quantitative survey was the same question we asked when we were launched back in 2006, which took a statement from a Dawkins lecture in the 1990s, faith is like a virus like smallpox, only harder to eradicate, and asked people to what extent they agreed and disagreed with that. That was the very first question we asked when we launched. We were horrified when 42% of people said they agreed with it. We published anyway, because you should be honest about these things, but that was not what we were expecting or wanting to hear. When we did it this time, it wanted to 21%. So still a sizable minority, but nonetheless a significant decline. So I think new atheism was significant. It made a difference, but I don't think it changed the course very much. When it comes to the future, writing a book at the moment, actually almost like a companion piece to the history of science fiction, was looking at the future of it. The history really alerted me to the fact that those times when science fiction has got sparky in the past, they tended not to have been about the nature of the cosmos or interpretation of the scriptures or whatever. That's been there, but actually deep down it's been about the nature of the human and different claims to what or who the human is and who has authority to say. Massively significant issue, time and time and time again throughout the history of science and religion. That is going to be an enormous question in the 21st century. So the chapters in the book I'm writing at the moment are on scientific immortality. Silicon Valley billionaires pouring vast amounts of money into slowing, reversing, stopping the aging process. What does that mean for being human? The idea that we might reach a double life expectancy again, let alone live forever. Obviously, artificial intelligence and the extent to which that will ever require recognition as having rights or dignity. Obviously, genetic modification and what that does. The question about recognizing animals as persons, big case in the US about whether Happy the elephant should be recognized as a person. Really, really interesting stuff. What would happen if SETI delivered the goods and we were actually to find contact with alien life? It may not think we might, but what would that mean for our position? These are huge questions on which science is, as it were, moving its tanks onto the lawn of what it is to be human. And I think that's they're the most fruitful areas of conversation and probably the most important as well.
Wonderful, thanks, Nick. Do we have any questions online? Okay, well, we are, oh, okay, great.
Would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yes, it is me, Osao Nugbewe from Church of the Nazarene in Barnsley. I actually agree with a statement that you made that actually science is actually faith-based. No, well, I am both a medical doctor and a reverend, so and I can actually agree with this. But I want you to actually throw more light into this particular, well, and I don't know whether I should actually call it a truth or an assertion. Can you just probably tell us more? How is science faith-based? I have my own answers anyway, but I just want to actually hear from you. How can we say science is faith-based?
It's a good question. I am conscious that even that statement sends a number of people absolutely apoplectic with rage because it lands them with a kind of identity that they spend their entire life trying to distance themselves from. A lot of it depends from what we understand from faith. For a lot of people, faith is simply a shorthand for blind faith, which is simply a shorthand for believing something without any evidence. That is the rhetoric. Science isn't like that at all. That's not my belief of science. But nor is, I think, the Christian faith like that. Both of them, I think, rely to some degree on trust. When I'm a lecturer importing scientific information to undergraduates, there has to be some element of trust in what I'm saying. There has to be trust in textbooks. There has to be trust in the basic process of the scientific method. There has to be trust in the reliability of laboratory equipment and so on and so forth. In the same way, I think religion is an exercise in trust. It's not uninformed trust. It's trust in which you draw as much reliable information from the scriptures, from experience of prayer, from community, that this is the kind of thing you want to dedicate your life to. But I don't think it's fundamentally different, qualitatively different, from the kind of trust that is exhibited in the scientific method. They're not identical at all. I don't want to, for a start, one of them is fundamentally existential, and I don't think the scientific one is quite as much. But because they're both social activities, they both rely on degrees of trust. And maybe that's a more helpful word than faith, which, as I said, tends to send people quite cross.
That's wonderful. Thank you. Well, I'm afraid we are out of time for the discussion session. We're going to move on to a short break in a moment. But first of all, Nick, just again, really want to thank you for the talk and the responses to the questions there. Really insightful and a great way to start off our session. So thank you.